A German soldier stepped to the cliff edge at dawn to relieve himself. He yawned, he looked down and froze. 60 faces stared back up at him from the darkness below, black with mud, completely silent, completely still. They had been there for hours. He opened his mouth to scream. Before any sound escaped, 60 curved blades came out of 60 sheaths at exactly the same moment. The sound was like silk being torn. He closed his mouth. He had heard the stories about these men. Every German soldier in Italy had heard the stories. He turned and ran. 3 minutes later, the major, the man who had held this fortress for 23 days, who had destroyed 3 British attacks, who had laughed at tanks and shrugged at artillery, walked to that same cliff edge and looked down. He stopped laughing. But to understand what he saw that morning, we need to go back to the mountain that had already swallowed 3 armies whole. There is a place in central Italy where the road to Rome narrows to almost nothing. On one side, a river valley. On the other, a mountain. And on that mountain, in the winter of 1944, sat a German position that military engineers had looked at and declared nearly impossible to take by force. They were not wrong. The bunkers were built from reinforced concrete 3 feet thick, not 3 inches, 3 feet. Artillery shells fired at close range had bounced off those walls like stones thrown against a castle. The machine gun nests were positioned so that every path leading up the mountain, every road, every trail, every open slope fell directly under their fire. There was no approach that the Germans had not already calculated, no angle they had not already covered. Below, in the valley, the road to Rome sat completely blocked, and it had been blocked for 23 days. The major who commanded this position had not been given it by accident. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, a professional soldier from Bavaria who had spent 3 years fighting on the Eastern Front before being transferred to Italy. The Eastern Front was where the war was decided in blood and frozen mud, where entire divisions were swallowed by the Russian winter and never seen again. Men who survived it, truly survived it, not just physically but mentally, came out the other side with something different in their eyes, a particular kind of patience, the patience of someone who had already seen the worst that war could offer and had decided quietly and without drama that he was not going to die in it. He had 150 soldiers under his command. He had food stockpiled for 2 months. He had enough ammunition to repel attack after attack after attack. And he had something else, something that mattered more than concrete or firepower. He had already won 3 times. The first British attack came straight up the main path. 200 infantry soldiers, rifles fixed, moving in formation, the way the training manuals said to move. The German machine guns opened up and did not stop. 80 men fell in the first 5 minutes. The rest retreated down the slope, dragging their wounded behind them. The second attack came with tanks. The British commanders had looked at the first failure and decided that the problem was firepower, that what they needed was armor, steel, something that bullets couldn't stop. So they sent tanks up the mountain road. The Germans had anticipated this. They had buried mines at every choke point, every place where the road narrowed, and a tank had no choice but to go forward or back. 3 tanks exploded. The rest reversed. The third attack was artillery. 1,200 shells, 6 hours of continuous bombardment that shook the ground across the entire valley, that could be heard in villages 10 miles away, that turned the air above the mountain into nothing but smoke and falling rock. When the smoke cleared, the German flag still flew. The concrete had not cracked. Not one bunker had been destroyed. The major walked through his position that morning, inspecting his defenses, checking his men. He had lost no one. The British had lost 340 soldiers across 3 attacks, dead, wounded, or missing. And every morning, when he woke up, the road to Rome was still his. He had refused every surrender demand. He would keep refusing. He was certain of that. In the valley below, in a British army camp that had stopped feeling temporary and started feeling permanent, a group of officers sat around maps they had been staring at for weeks. The maps showed the mountain. They showed the bunkers. They showed the fields of fire, the minefields, the approaches that had already failed 3 times. And they showed, on the far side of the position, almost as an afterthought, a thin line indicating a cliff face on the northern slope. No one paid attention to that line. It was marked as impassable. Everyone agreed on that, except for one man who wasn't in the room. Subadar Lal Bahadur Thapa was 26 years old. He had joined the British Army at 18, which meant he had now spent nearly a third of his life as a soldier. Before that, he had spent his entire childhood in a village, high in the Himalayan mountains of Nepal, a place where the nearest flat ground was thousands of feet below, where the paths between villages ran along cliff edges that would make most people dizzy just to look at, where young boys learned to move across vertical rock faces before they learned to read. He was not tall. He was not physically imposing in the way that military heroes are sometimes described. He was quiet, genuinely quiet, not the performed quietness of someone who wants to seem mysterious, but the natural quietness of a man who had learned early that careful observation was worth more than fast talking. He commanded 60 soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, 5th Royal Gurkha Rifles. They came from the same mountains he came from, the same villages, the same valleys. Most of them were around 22 years old. Most of them had been farmers or shepherds before the war. They had grown up doing what people from the flatlands called impossible, carrying heavy loads up near vertical paths, moving across ice and loose rock at high altitude, navigating terrain in conditions that would stop a trained mountaineer. For them, it was just how you got from one place to another. Lal Bahadur spent 2 days walking around the base of the mountain, not attacking, not planning, just walking and looking. British officers who saw him assumed he was getting familiar with the terrain for the next assault. They did not ask him what he was doing. He was a Gurkha Subadar, a rank, roughly equivalent to a sergeant, and in 9,944, British officers did not typically ask Gurkha Subadars what they were thinking about. That was a mistake. On the 2nd day, Lal Bahadur stopped at the northern face of the mountain. He stood there for a long time. The cliff in front of him rose 400 feet, almost straight up. The rock surface was weathered limestone, old, hard, worn smooth in places by centuries of rain. There were cracks, there were small ledges, there were places where the rock had fractured and left narrow channels that a careful hand could fit into. Not many, not obvious, but there. More importantly, there were no guards, not one. The Germans had placed their soldiers on every approach that could realistically be used. Every path, every slope, every route that a trained military planner would look at and identify as a possible attack vector. They had covered everything that appeared on the maps. They had not covered the cliff, because the cliff did not appear to need covering. Everyone knew it was impossible to climb. Lal Bahadur went to find Colonel Harrison. The conversation was short. He explained what he had seen. He explained what he believed was possible. He explained that his men had grown up in terrain like this, that what looked impossible from the valley floor was something different when you had spent your entire life moving across mountain rock. Colonel Harrison listened. He was not a cruel man or a stupid one. He looked at the cliff. He looked at Lal Bahadur. "That cliff cannot be climbed," he said, "and even if your men could somehow manage it, they would be carrying 40 pounds of equipment each. Their rifles alone weigh 10 pounds. If they made it to the top, they would arrive exhausted, trapped, completely exposed. German soldiers would shoot them off that cliff like targets." Lal Bahadur did not argue. He asked for permission to look more closely. Harrison agreed, expecting nothing to come of it. That night, Lal Bahadur took 2 of his best climbers to the base of the cliff. In complete darkness, they climbed, not to the top, just high enough to understand the rock, to feel where the holds were, to find the angles where the limestone had broken in useful ways, to locate what he was looking for. At 280 feet, he found it, a ledge, 15 feet wide, flat, completely hidden from view above by an overhang, large enough for 60 men to stand on. He climbed back down and went to Harrison again. Harrison took the idea to brigade headquarters. Brigade headquarters said no. They wanted a proper attack, armor support, airstrikes, a coordinated assault using the full resources available to a modern army. They said that hill farmers with knives could not crack a fortress position. They said that modern war required modern weapons. Lal Bahadur was refused. The man who changed that decision was not a general. He was a British artillery officer, a major whose job was to observe attacks and call in cannon fire. He had watched all 3 British assaults from forward positions. He had called in shells on the German bunkers and watched them bounce off. He had written the coordinates into his notebook and filed his reports and done his job correctly, and it had accomplished nothing. He knew what the generals in their tents were planning. He knew it would fail the same way the first 3 had failed. He went outside the chain of command. He spoke to someone who had the ear of the divisional commander. He made one argument, simply, give the Gurkhas one night. If anyone could do this, it was these men. On June 13th, 1944, permission came through. Lal Bahadur gathered his 60 soldiers and told them what they were going to do. Not one man hesitated. Not one man asked if it was possible. They had climbed harder than this back home. They had done it in snow and ice and wind. They could do it here, in the warm Italian summer air, with the road to Rome waiting at the bottom of the other side. They had 3 days, 3 nights to turn what everyone called impossible into something they had already done. They had 3 nights, not 3 weeks, not 3 months. 3 nights to learn how to do something that no military unit had ever done before, climb 400 feet of vertical rock in complete darkness, in total silence, carrying the weight of a full combat load without losing a single man. Other soldiers might have spent those nights arguing about whether it was possible. The Gurkhas spent them climbing. The practice cliff was 2 miles south of the German position. Similar rock, similar angle, similar height. Lal Bahadur had found it on his 2nd day of walking the mountain. The same walk that everyone else had assumed was reconnaissance for a conventional attack. He had been planning this since before he asked for permission. The first night they established the rules. No lights, no ropes, no sound. Each man would carry his full combat load rifle, ammunition. 2 canteens of water, rations, and his kukri. The total weight for the smaller men came close to 60 pounds. There would be no leaving equipment behind. If they reached the top without their rifles, they were not soldiers, they were just men on a cliff. They would move, one at a time, 30 seconds apart. Enough space so that if one man slipped, he would not take the man below him down with him. Enough separation so that 60 men moving in darkness would not sound like 60 men, but like wind, like settling rock, like the ordinary noises a mountain makes in the night. They began. The first hour showed them what they did not yet know. 8 men could not make the full climb, not because they lacked courage. Courage was not the problem. The problem was technique. They were approaching the rock the way soldiers approach obstacles, directly, forcefully, with the assumption that willpower could substitute for method. It could not. Not here. Not on rock that punished every mistake immediately and without appeal. Lal Bahadur watched each man who struggled. He did not remove them from the mission. He went to each one, individually, in the dark, and showed them what they were doing wrong. Not with words. There were no words in the dark at 200 feet, with his hands on their hands, with his feet placed next to their feet, showing them the angle, showing them where to put their weight. By the third night, all 60 men made the climb. No ropes, no sound, full equipment. They came off the practice cliff in the early hours before dawn, and Lal Bahadur sat alone at the base of the rock for a long time after the last man descended. He knew what the practice cliff was not. It was not the real cliff. On the real cliff, 150 German soldiers sat 50 feet above the ledge with machine guns and grenades and 3 years of combat experience. On the real cliff, a single falling stone, at the wrong moment, a single boot scraping too hard against limestone would bring everything down on them at once. He knew this. He did not say it to his men. There was nothing useful in saying it. The night of June 13th arrived the way important nights often do, quietly, without announcement, looking exactly like every other night. The sun went down at 9:23 in the evening. The Gurkhas were already in position, lying flat in a drainage ditch at the base of the cliff, faces blackened with mud, equipment checked and rechecked, every buckle and strap tested for sound. They had been there since before dark. They would not move until Lal Bahadur gave the signal. Above them, in the German position, dinner was being served. A generator hummed somewhere inside the main bunker. A card game had started in the eastern post, the same card game that had apparently been running for 11 days. The same 4 soldiers rotating in and out as their shifts changed. In the observation post, at the top of the main wall, a sentry stood with his rifle on his shoulder and his eyes pointed outward down the slopes. Across the valley, toward the places where British soldiers would come from if they were foolish enough to attack again. No one was looking at the cliff behind them. Why would they? At 11:47 p.m., Lal Bahadur pressed his palm flat against the rock. He looked back once at the 60 men lying in the ditch. 60 pairs of eyes looked back at him. He turned to the cliff and began to climb. The rock was cold, not the comfortable cool of a summer evening, but the deep cold that limestone holds, the cold of something that has been in shadow for centuries and has no interest in warming to the touch of human hands. Within the first 50 feet, that cold moved through his fingers and settled into his knuckles. He registered it and moved past it. Each movement was a small negotiation. Left hand finds a crack, fingers go in sideways. Knuckle deep, test the hold. Feel for loose material. find the solid core. Right foot finds a ledge, not a ledge, a slight depression in the surface, barely an inch of purchase, but enough if the weight goes on the ball of the foot and not the heel. Right hand moves up slowly, no scraping. Find the next crack. Left foot follows, 6 inches at a time. Behind him, 30 seconds back, the second man was doing the same. Behind that man, another, and another. 60 men on a 400-foot cliff face, each one separated from the next by 30 seconds of darkness and the sound of their own breathing. The night air smelled like wild thyme and limestone dust. Far below, the drainage ditch where they had waited was already invisible. Far above, the rim of the German position was a straight line against the stars. They climbed toward it without making a sound. At 100 feet, the cliff changed. The lower section had been weathered into something almost manageable, cracks running in predictable directions, ledges where the rock had split along natural fault lines. At 100 feet, the surface became younger, harder, less forgiving. The holds became smaller. The angles became less helpful. A move that had worked perfectly 10 feet lower would not work here. The rock demanded adjustments that had to be discovered in real time, in the dark, without the ability to look down and recalculate. One man's foot slipped. The sound of boot leather on limestone, a single scrape, half a second long. Every man on the cliff froze. This was not something they had discussed or practiced. It was instinct, the same instinct that makes every animal on a hillside go still when one of them sounds an alarm. 60 men stopped breathing as much as they could stop breathing and pressed themselves against the rock and listened. Above them, nothing changed. The generator still hummed. The wind still moved across the upper wall. No lights came on. No bootsmiths moved toward the cliff edge. The man who had slipped had caught himself with both hands' fingers jammed into a crack, knuckles white in darkness no one could see. He found a new placement for his foot. He tested it. He continued, climbing. Below him, one by one, the other men started moving again. At 200 feet, the body began to make its arguments. The hands had been gripping limestone for over an hour. The small muscles in the fingers, the ones that most people never think about because most people never need them, were exhausted in a way that felt different from normal tiredness. Not weak, exactly, but tight, threatening to cramp in ways that could not be allowed to happen at 200 feet with no rope. The shoulders ached from the weight of the equipment. 60 pounds distributed across a pack and a rifle and bandoliers of ammunition feels manageable on flat ground. On a vertical surface, it becomes a conversation between your body and gravity is making a very persuasive case for letting go. Sweat ran down faces despite the cool air. No one stopped. Not one man on that cliff asked for a rest that could not be given. They had come from villages where complaining about difficulty was not a social option, where the mountain simply was what it was, and you either crossed it or you did not, and no amount of talking changed the height of the pass or the weight of the load. They climbed. One hand. Find the hold. Test it. Pull one foot. Find the ledge. Test it. Push. Breathe slowly. Do not think about the ground below. Do not think about what happens if a cramp takes your hand at the wrong moment. Do not think about the machine guns 50 feet above the ledge you have not yet reached. Find the next hold. Just the next hold. At 2:23 in the morning, the first man pulled himself over the lip of the ledge at 280 feet. He rolled onto his back and lay completely flat, chest heaving, staring up at the underside of the limestone overhang 6 feet above him. He did not make a sound. He controlled his breathing, the way they had practiced through the nose. Slow, measured, until it came back to something normal. 30 seconds later, the second man arrived. Then the third. Then the fourth. They spread across the ledge in the darkness, finding places to sit or lie without touching each other unnecessarily, without moving equipment that might scrape or clatter. The ledge was 15 feet wide and perhaps 20 feet deep at its widest point. For 60 men in full combat gear, it was barely enough, but it was exactly enough, which was all it needed to be. The last man reached the ledge at 2:23 in the morning, 2 hours and 36 minutes from the first hand on the rock to the last man up. 60 men, not one sound that reached German ears, not one piece of equipment dropped, not one man lost. Now came the part that no amount of training had fully prepared them for. They had to wait. They could not move forward. The German bunkers were directly above them, 50 feet of open rock face with no cover whatsoever. In daylight, a single soldier looking over the edge would see them immediately. In darkness, the sound of 60 men climbing that final section would echo off the overhang and announce them just as clearly. They could not go back down. Going back down meant the mission was over. The Germans remained in place, and the road to Rome stayed closed. For however many more weeks it would take the British to think of something else. So they sat on a ledge 15 feet wide, 50 feet below 150 enemy soldiers in the last hours before dawn, and they waited. Some men checked their rifles one final time, fingers moving across metal and wood in the darkness with the automatic certainty of something done 10,000 times before. Some men closed their eyes, not to sleep, just to rest them, to give them something to do that did not involve staring at rock they could not see anyway. Lal Bahadur did not close his eyes. He sat with his back against the limestone and looked up at the overhang above him and thought about what came next. Not the plan was fixed. There was nothing left to adjust. He thought about his men. He thought about the 60 families in the mountain villages of Nepal who did not know their sons were sitting on a rock ledge inside a German fortress in the middle of Italy, in the middle of the night. He thought about the morning. At 4:15, the sky began to change. The black above the cliff rim turned to a very dark blue, the blue that comes before any hint of actual light, the color the sky makes when it has decided that dawn is coming, but has not yet committed to it. Stars began to disappear from the edges of the sky, working their way inward toward the center. Lal Bahadur could now see the faces of his men. They looked tired. Every one of them looked tired in the way that only comes from sustained physical effort, followed by sustained stillness, the particular exhaustion of a body that has pushed hard and then been told to stop and wait when every instinct said to keep moving. But they were ready. He could see that too. Every man had his rifle across his lap. Every man had his kukri loose in its sheath, not drawn, but accessible. The leather strap unsnapped, the handle clear. They had not been told to do this. They had done it sometime in the dark hours of waiting, each man on his own, arriving at the same conclusion separately. At 4:47, a German soldier walked to the edge of the cliff above them. He was on the early morning patrol, the first movement of the day before the main watch change, a routine that had been running on this position for 23 days without variation. He was yawning. He was thinking about going back to his bunk after the patrol, about sleeping for 2 more hours before breakfast. He stopped at the cliff edge. He looked down. The yawning stopped. 60 faces looked back up at him. For 3 full seconds, no one on either side moved. Then Lal Bahadur stood up. In one motion, without hurry, without drama, he drew his kukri from its sheath and raised it above his head. The 18-inch blade caught the very first light of the Italian morning. It caught it the way a mirror catches light, completely, instantly, turning it into something that could be seen from a distance. The German soldier looked at the blade. He looked at the man holding it. He looked at the 59 other men who had not yet moved. He closed his mouth. He turned around. He ran. The sound of his boots on the stone above them was the first sound any of them had heard from the German position since the card game ended some time after midnight. They listened to it fade toward the main bunker. Lal Bahadur lowered his kukri, but did not sheath it. He looked at his men. No one spoke. No one needed to. 2 minutes later, perhaps 3, they heard a different sound from above. Slower footsteps, deliberate ones. The footsteps of someone who had been told something alarming and had decided not to run toward it, but to walk. Because running would mean the thing was real, and walking meant he still had control of the situation. The major appeared at the cliff edge. He looked down. He was a professional soldier with 3 years of Eastern Front experience. He had seen things on the Russian steppe that most human beings will never see and cannot fully imagine. He had made tactical decisions under artillery fire in blizzard conditions while his unit was being destroyed around him. He was not a man who was easily surprised, but he stood at that cliff edge and was completely still for a very long time, because what he saw below him could not be explained by any tactical framework he had ever been given. 60 soldiers were sitting on a ledge 50 feet below his position, behind his walls, behind his wire, behind his minefields and his machine gun nests and his carefully constructed fields of fire. Everything he had built faced outward, everything. And these men had come from the one direction that no one had defended because no one had believed it needed defending. He looked at them for a long time. Then he straightened up and called down in the broken English he had learned somewhere at some point before any of this had started. You have climbed well, but you are trapped. You cannot come up. You cannot stay there. Surrender now, and you will be treated fairly under the rules of war. He was offering them a way out. He meant it as the professional courtesy of one soldier to another, an acknowledgement of what they had accomplished, combined with a realistic assessment of their situation. They were on a ledge. He was above them with 150 men. The tactical reality had not changed, simply because they had managed to get where they were. Lal Bahadur looked up at him. He did not speak. He did not gesture. He reached down to his sheath, took hold of his kukri, and drew it slowly, completely, deliberately, and raised it straight above his head. And then, without a word, without an order, without any signal that anyone watching could have identified as a command, 59 men stood up. 59 kukris came out of 59 sheaths. The sound moved across the cliff face and up the rock and over the edge, like something physical, like a change in air pressure, like the moment before lightning, when every hair on your arms stands up and you understand, without being told, that something is about to happen, that you cannot stop. 60 blades raised. Still, the major stood at the cliff edge and looked at them. He was doing the same calculation that any competent officer would do. In that moment, the same cold arithmetic of combat that strips everything down to numbers and probabilities and likely outcomes. His machine guns could cut down many of them on that final 50 feet of open rock, possibly most of them, The mathematics were arguably in his favor, but not all of them. Some would make it to the top, and the men who made it to the top would come over that edge with kukris in their hands, and the particular energy of men who have just climbed 400 feet of cliff in the dark and survived, which is a kind of energy that is almost impossible to stop once it has decided where it is going. He looked at his own soldiers, the ones near enough to see. He read their faces, the way a commander learns to read faces. After enough time, the particular expression that tells you what a man will do before he does it. They were good soldiers. They had held this position for 23 days, against everything a modern army could bring against them. They had done everything he had asked of them, and more. But they did not want to fight Gurkhas hand-to-hand in the dark corners of concrete bunkers, where machine guns could not aim, and numbers did not matter, and the only thing that counted was the willingness to keep going after the point where most men stopped. He knew that. He looked back down at the ledge. Lal Bahadur had not moved. The kukri was still raised. The 60 blades were still raised. And the major understood with the complete clarity that comes to professional soldiers in the moments when everything becomes simple that the question in front of him was not a tactical question. It was never going to be answered by counting guns or calculating angles of fire. The question was this: how much is this worth? He stood at that cliff edge for a long time. Below him, 60 blades did not waver. Not one arm lowered. Not one man shifted his weight, or looked away, or gave any indication that holding a kukri above his head at 5 in the morning, after climbing 400 feet of vertical rock in the dark, was something that required effort. They simply waited, the way the mountain waited. The T-stone waits. The major had held this position for 23 days. He had held it against 200 infantry, against tanks, against 1,200 artillery shells fired in 6 continuous hours that shook the ground across the entire valley and accomplished nothing except to fill the air with noise and smoke. He had written reports after each attack, calm, professional reports that described enemy losses and German defensive performance in the measured language of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that emotion had no place in military documentation. He had sent those reports up the chain of command and received commendations in return. He had been told he was doing exactly what was required of him. He had believed that. He had been right. But standing at the cliff edge in the grey light of an Italian morning, looking down at 60 raised blades belonging to 60 men who had just done something that his entire understanding of military possibility said could not be done. He understood something that no commendation had prepared him for. The fortress he had defended so successfully was not the bunkers. It was not the concrete or the wire or the carefully positioned machine guns. The fortress was the belief shared equally by the British who attacked and the Germans who defended that there were limits to what soldiers could do. Limits imposed by terrain, by physics, by the reasonable expectations of what human bodies were capable of under combat conditions. The British had attacked within those limits 3 times and failed 3 times. The Gurkhas had simply decided. The limits did not apply to them, and now they were inside his walls. He turned away from the cliff edge. He walked back to the main bunker. He did not hurry. At 7:12 in the morning, the white flags appeared. Not one flag, multiple flags. One from the main bunker, one from the eastern observation post, one from the machine gun nest on the northern wall. as if every position had been waiting for permission and received it at the same moment. 150 German soldiers came out with their hands raised. They came out in the careful, deliberate way that soldiers surrender when they are not broken, when they are not fleeing from something that has overwhelmed them, but choosing to stop because the man they trust to make that decision has made it. They were not defeated in the way that armies are defeated by superior force. They were standing down because their commander had looked at a situation and arrived at a conclusion, and they trusted his conclusions. They filed out of their bunkers into the morning light. Lal Bahadur and his 60 men climbed the last 50 feet. There was no scramble, no rush. They climbed the final section the same way they had climbed the first 350 feet, carefully, methodically, one hold at a time, because that was how they climbed, and a surrendering enemy did not change the technique. When Lal Bahadur came over the top of the wall, the major was standing 20 feet away. They looked at each other across that distance. No words were exchanged in that first moment. There are situations where two men understand each other completely, without language, where rank and nationality and the machinery of war that put them on opposite sides of a cliff fall away, and what remains is simply one soldier looking at another and knowing exactly what the other one did and what it cost. The major had held a fortress for 23 days. Lal Bahadur had climbed the wall nobody guarded. Both of them had done their jobs. The major nodded once. Lal Bahadur accepted the surrender. The position that had cost 340 British casualties across 3 attacks, the position that had blocked the road for 23 days, that had absorbed 1,200 artillery shells without cracking, that military engineers had looked at and called nearly impossible to take by force, fell in complete silence. 0 Allied casualties, not one Gurkha wounded, not one shot fired in the taking of it. Word traveled the way it always travels in armies, not through official channels, not through reports filed in triplicate and sent up the chain of command, but through soldiers talking to soldiers, through prisoners talking to guards, through the specific accelerating momentum of a story that seems impossible until the people who were there confirm it, and then becomes the only thing anyone wants to talk about. By the end of the first day, every German position on the mountain knew what had happened at the fortress. They knew the cliff. They knew the ledge. They knew the 60 men who had sat in darkness for 2 hours and 40 minutes on a 15-foot shelf of rock 50 feet below 150 armed soldiers and waited for the sun to come up. By the end of the second day, they knew about the kukris. By the morning of the third day, 72 hours after the white flags had appeared above the fortress, 17 other German positions along the mountain had surrendered. Some of them surrendered when they saw Gurkha units forming up at the base of their hills. Not after an attack, not after a demand, just at the sight of those particular soldiers moving into position below them. One position sent out a message before any formal contact was made. A German officer, through a British interpreter, said simply, "We will not wait for you to climb our walls. We prefer to live." Another position, one that British intelligence had assessed as holding 200 men with 6 weeks of supplies, gave up on the second day. When British officers asked the commander why he had surrendered a position that by any conventional military calculation he should have been able to hold, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I saw what happened at the fortress. I saw the cliff. I know we have cliffs too. The German army, being the organization it was, responded to what had happened. The way all armies respond to a new threat they do not fully understand. They wrote it down. A captured German tactical document from late June 1944 contained a new section that had not existed in previous versions. It addressed Gurkha infiltration methods. It instructed German commanders to post guards on all approaches to their positions, including rock faces and cliff sections that appeared impossible to climb. It stated that any vertical surface under 500 feet should be considered a potential Gurkha approach route, and it contained a recommendation that no German military document had ever contained before. It said that if Gurkha soldiers were identified behind a defensive position, commanders should give serious consideration to immediate surrender because close-quarters combat with this particular force produced casualties that were, in the document's precise language, unacceptable. The British Army took different lessons. Before the climb, Gurkha soldiers were valued for their courage and their reliability, qualities that British officers had earned and respected for over a century of shared service, but valued in a specific way. Valued as fighters who executed plans made by others. Valued as soldiers who went where they were directed and did what they were told, with exceptional skill and without complaint. Monte Cassino changed that framing permanently. A report written by a British major 3 months after the climb said it clearly. He wrote that the British Army had been so focused on what it believed was possible that it had failed to ask its Gurkha soldiers what they knew was possible. That the solution to a problem that had killed 340 men across 3 conventional attacks had been available the entire time, sitting in a Gurkha subadar's understanding of a cliff face, waiting for someone to ask. He wrote that they had planned to break walls with bombs. The Gurkhas had gone around the walls, and in doing so, he wrote, they had reminded the entire army that the purpose of war is not to destroy the enemy. It is to make the enemy stop. The cliff got a name, not officially, not on any map printed by any government cartography office, but on the hand-drawn maps that soldiers made for each other, on the sketches passed between units moving through the area, on the markers that veterans pointed to when they brought other people to see the mountain years later. They called it Gurkha's ladder. 3 men carried the memory of that night in 3 different ways. Lal Bahadur Thapa went home to Nepal in 1946. The British Army awarded him the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor Britain gives, the medal that sits above all others, the one that in its entire history has been awarded to fewer than 1,500 men across all branches of service in all wars combined. Only 13 Gurkhas have ever received it. He carried the medal home in his pack. He put it in a drawer. He wrapped it in cloth, the way you wrap something you want to protect, and he put it away and did not take it out again. He went back to his village. He farmed. He raised goats. He grew barley in the mountain fields where he had grown up, in the shadow of the peaks that had taught him everything he had needed to know. When neighbors asked about the war, he said what he always said. I did my duty. Many others did more. He died in 1968 at the age of 50. His son found the Victoria Cross in the drawer after the funeral, wrapped in cloth, never displayed. Next to it was a small rock, smooth, grey, unremarkable, the kind of stone you could find on any mountainside in Italy or Nepal, or anywhere else in the world. And next to the rock was a letter. The letter was from the British artillery officer who had gone outside the chain of command to give 60 Gurkha soldiers one night. After the war ended, he had gone back to the mountain alone. He had climbed to the ledge in daylight. He had sat there for a while, looking out at the Italian valley below, thinking about the men who had sat in darkness on this same shelf of rock and waited for the sun. Before he left, he picked up a stone from the ledge. He sent it to Lal Bahadur with a letter that said, "This rock was under your feet on the night. You changed how the world thinks about what is possible. Keep it to remember that impossible is just a word used by people who quit too early." The major went to a British prisoner of war camp in southern Italy. He was held there until 1947. Then he went home to Bavaria. He became a teacher, history and geography, which was perhaps the most honest work a man with his particular education could find. He taught in a small town for the rest of his working life. In 9965, a British veteran who had fought at Monte Cassino was traveling through Germany on vacation. He found the major's name in a telephone directory. By chance, he called the number. They met for coffee. The British veteran asked him, eventually, whether he regretted the decision he had made that morning at the cliff edge. The major was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I saved 150 lives that day, including my own. Some of my fellow officers said I was a coward, but those officers were not standing at that cliff edge, looking down at 60 raised blades." He picked up his coffee cup. "Courage is knowing when to fight," he said. "Wisdom is knowing when fighting will only get your men killed for nothing." I have never had difficulty telling the difference. The rock face on the northern slope of the mountain still stands exactly as it stood in June of 1944. Limestone does not change on human timescales. The cracks are where they were. The ledge at 280 feet is exactly as wide as it was on the night. 60 men sat on it in the dark and waited for dawn. The final 50 feet above it looks, to anyone standing at the base and looking up, exactly as impossible as it looked to the British officers, who decided it did not need to be considered. At the base of the cliff, there is a plaque. It is written in 3 languages, Italian, English, and Nepali. It says that on the night of June 13th, 1944, 60 soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Royal Gurkha Rifles, climbed this cliff and accepted the surrender of the German position above. It says they achieved through courage and skill what force could not accomplish. Every year, on the anniversary of the climb, a small group of people gathers at that plaque. British veterans, when they were still alive to make the journey. Italian villagers whose families have lived near this mountain for generations. And Gurkha soldiers, young men, serving soldiers, men who come from the same villages and the same mountain valleys as the 60 men who made the climb, who stand at the base of the rock and look up at it and understand, without being told, what it means to come from people who do what others say cannot be done. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of the climb, a group of surviving members of the original unit made the journey back to Italy. They were all over 80 years old. One of them stood at the base of the cliff for a long time. Then he started climbing. It took him 8 hours. He stopped twice. Younger soldiers stayed close, ready to help if he needed it. He did not ask for help. When he reached the ledge, at 280 feet, he sat down on the rock the way that 60 of them had sat down 60 years before back against the limestone, legs stretched out, looking out at the Italian valley spreading below in the afternoon light. A journalist who had come to cover the anniversary asked him, when he came back down, why he had done it. He thought about the question for a moment. Then he said, to prove I still could. There is a version of this story that ends with tactics and doctrine, with the training manuals that changed, the mountain warfare schools that were built, the ranger programs that incorporated vertical infiltration into their curriculum, the long chain of military consequence that runs forward from one June night in 1944 to Special Forces units, practicing the same basic principles on the same basic rock faces decades later. All of that is real, all of that happened, but that is not what the story is about. The story is about a man who walked around a mountain for 2 days while everyone else was planning the next version of the same failed attack, and saw a cliff that no one was guarding, and understood from a childhood spent moving across vertical rock in the Himalayas that what everyone called impossible was actually just something no one had tried the right way yet. It is about 60 men who climbed 400 feet in the dark, in complete silence, carrying 60 pounds of equipment with machine guns 50 feet above their destination, because their leader had said it was possible, and they trusted him, not blindly, not because they had no choice, but because they had watched him, and they knew him, and they understood that he did not say things he did not believe. It is about a German officer who looked down at 60 raised blades and made the hardest decision a soldier ever makes, the decision to stop, to put down what he was defending, to choose the lives of his men over the continuation of a fight that had, in that moment, already been decided by something that had nothing to do with concrete walls or machine gun ranges. He was not defeated by superior force. He was defeated by superior will, and perhaps that is the only lesson that any of it was ever really about. Walls are only as strong as the assumptions that build them. The cliff was always climbable. It just needed someone who didn't already believe it wasn't. All of that is real. All of that happened. But that is not what the story is about. The story is about a man who walked around a mountain for 2 days while everyone else was planning the next version of the same failed attack, and saw a cliff that no one was guarding, and understood from a childhood spent moving across vertical rock in the Himalayas that what everyone called impossible was actually just something no one had tried the right way yet. It is about 60 men who climbed 400 feet in the dark, in complete silence, carrying 60 pounds of equipment with machine guns 50 feet above their destination, because their leader had said it was possible, and they trusted him, not blindly, not because they had no choice, but because they had watched him, and they knew him, and they understood that he did not say things he did not believe. It is about a German officer who looked down at 60 raised blades and made the hardest decision a soldier ever makes, the decision to stop, to put down what he was defending, to choose the lives of his men over the continuation of a fight that had, in that moment, already been decided by something that had nothing to do with concrete walls or machine gun ranges. He was not defeated by superior force. He was defeated by superior will, and perhaps that is the only lesson that any of it was ever really about. Walls are only as strong as the assumptions that build them. The cliff was always climbable. It just needed someone who didn't already believe it wasn't. All of that is real. All of that happened. But that is not what the story is about. The story is about a man who walked around a mountain for 2 days while everyone else was planning the next version of the same failed attack, and saw a cliff that no one was guarding, and understood from a childhood spent moving across vertical rock in the Himalayas that what everyone called impossible was actually just something no one had tried the right way yet. It is about 60 men who climbed 400 feet in the dark, in complete silence, carrying 60 pounds of equipment with machine guns 50 feet above their destination, because their leader had said it was possible, and they trusted him, not blindly, not because they had no choice, but because they had watched him, and they knew him, and they understood that he did not say things he did not believe. It is about a German officer who looked down at 60 raised blades and made the hardest decision a soldier ever makes, the decision to stop, to put down what he was defending, to choose the lives of his men over the continuation of a fight that had, in that moment, already been decided by something that had nothing to do with concrete walls or machine gun ranges. He was not defeated by superior force. He was defeated by superior will, and perhaps that is the only lesson that any of it was ever really about. Walls are only as strong as the assumptions that build them. The cliff was always climbable. It just needed someone who didn't already believe it wasn't.